The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple to speak on the amendment.
Members, I don't believe this Mr. Tallarico's amendment has anything to do with DEI office. We have admissions in the bill, so I would leave it to the will of the House.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tallarico to speak. Closing the amendment. Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I was hoping to ask the author of the bill some questions on this amendment.
Mr. Tallarico has the microphone now.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I've heard many times in this microphone today on this bill that we don't want to give preferential treatment to anyone. If that's true for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, that should be true for students from advantaged backgrounds. That would include any of our children or grandchildren. And I urge you to vote yes on the amendment.
Mr. Tallarico sends up an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs in adoption of the amendment. This is a record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Show Mr. Tallarico voting aye, Ms. Collier voting aye, Mr. Kemple voting nay, Mr. D'Alia voting nay, Ms. Morales voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 59 ayes and 76 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment. Where is she?
Amendment by Howard.
The chair recognizes Ms. Howard to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I actually want to first say I very much appreciate what Chairman Kemple has done to try to help us have a better bill on the House side than came to us from the Senate. I sincerely appreciate that. That being said, I still look at this as a bill that is a solution in search of a problem. If we're going to be talking about preferential treatment, which indeed I consider DEI to be something that just helps us achieve the goals that we have for our state of encouraging all students to participate in higher education, and some students require more assistance than others. That's just the nature of the way that it is. But we want to call it preferential, so I'm going to be looking at the fact here that women increasingly outpace men in college graduation and enrollment rates. According to the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, women accounted for nearly 60% of all college students by the end of the 21-22 academic year. Women's rise in education can be easily explained by the passage of Title IX in 1972, the promotion of gender equality in education since then, and gains made in the labor force participation over the last few decades. Women have outnumbered men in terms of student population consistently since 2000. In 2016, the number of women enrolled in Juris Doctorate programs moved past 50% for the first time. Female enrollees then proceeded to outnumber male enrollees in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. In 2021, women once again outnumbered men in law school classrooms. Specifically, women made up 55.29% of all students in ABA-approved law schools. The proportion of women students has been rising over recent years, from 46.9% in 2015 to 49.5% in 2018, and in 2019, women comprised 50.5% of all medical school students. In fall 2020, female students made up 58% of total undergraduate enrollment. Women made up 58% of total undergraduate enrollment. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, among 2021 high school graduates aged 16 to 24, The college enrollment rate for young women at 69.5% in October 2021 continued to be higher than the rate for young men, which was 54.9%. And according to the Pew Research Center, women have overtaken men and now account for more than half of the college-educated labor workforce in the United States. Women's labor force participation was 57.4% in 2019, up from 57.1% in 2018. Men's labor force participation, which has always been much higher than that for women, was flat, 69.2%, 69.1%. This is an amendment that says we will not give preferential treatment to men in terms of their application process to the higher education institutions or engage in any promotional activities that encourage men to apply for mentorship programs, educational programs, athletics, or any other student activities or programs. I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kimple in opposition to the amendment.
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. I do believe that I know that this bill does not affect the application process, so I'll respectfully oppose.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Gentleman yields for questions.
Yeah, Representative Kimple, I know you were just about to talk about the application process, but my reading of Representative Howard's amendment is that it also includes promotional activities that encourage men to apply for mentorship programs, educational programs, other student activities. Now, other sections of the bill as it stands do limit the ability of universities to do these programs on the basis of race, ethnicity. Isn't that correct?
We are promoting diversity the bill proposes to close DEI offices, but maintain student activities, applications, recruitment, all as it is.
So my understanding of Representative Howard's amendment is it just makes sure that some of those DEI activities don't occur specifically for men as they make up a smaller and smaller percentage of universities.
It applies to everybody.
Okay, so why not accept this amendment that provides some intellectual consistency throughout the bill?
Because I think we're consistent in the legislation that it applies towards everybody.
Okay. So if the bill is going to limit DEI activities directed at ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, why not also limit it at activities specifically targeted to men?
I think the bill covers everybody equally.
Okay. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Ms. Howard to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, quite frankly, as we said, this is really not about preferential treatment. That's not what this is about at all. We have goals in this state to try to educate the Texas population to be able to join our workforce, to be educated in our higher education institutions, and we have a duty to ensure that the future of the state of Texas and our economics are supported by having an educated workforce. We have a diverse population that requires that we do different things within our institutions to encourage students from a wide cross-section of our state to participate in higher education. That is all that this should be about. This is not about preferential treatment that's denying one population over another. This is about making sure that all Texans can get the jobs that we need. We do not have the workforce right now. We do not have it. And the demographics of our state are such that we have to do all we can to encourage all students in this state, regardless of their particular circumstances, to be able to attend higher education so that we can have that educated workforce pipeline.
Mr. Speaker?
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
Will the gentlelady yield
Will the
for a few
gentlelady
questions?
yield for questions?
I will.
She yields for questions.
No. Representative Howard, I know both you and I wish we weren't having this conversation on the House floor at all right now and are supportive of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in our universities. Given that this legislation is specifically targeting programs designed for people of color, for first-generation college students, for our Hispanic communities, for students who are gender diverse or LGBTQ, Do you think your amendment adds some intellectual consistency to this bill?
It adds consistency in the fact that we're trying, as the bill states, to not give preferential treatment to any particular demographic of our state. I quite frankly believe that the bill is not necessary and that we need to be encouraging all Texans to attend higher education so that we can have the educated workforce we need. But in order to be consistent, we don't want to give preferential treatment to anyone. And the fact is that more women than men are attending higher education right now. Let's not put anything in place that gives preferential treatment to men. If we're going to be doing that for anyone else, then we might as well do it for the men as well.
Thank you, Representative Howard, for your
Thank
amendment.
you. Move adoption.
Ms. Howard sends out an amendment. The amendment is not acceptably altered. The question occurs on the adoption amendment. Is record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Show Mr. Kimball voting nay. Ms. Howard voting aye. Mr. Badialia voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 58 ayes and 82 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Niave Criado.
The chair recognizes Ms. Niave Criado to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. The first part of the bill in section 50.001 talks about how public institution of higher education must be committed to creating an environment of intellectual inquiry and academic freedom, intellectual diversity, so that all students are respected and educated regardless of race, sex, or ethnicity. And so what this amendment does, it will include in part of the bill that the governing board will ensure that the institutions do not hire a person with known ties to a hate group or domestic terrorist organizations. And I want to talk about that because the DPS, Texas Domestic Terrorism Threat Assessment, in January 2020 said domestic terrorism poses a persistent and varied threat to the state of Texas. One of the main types of domestic terrorism includes racially motivated. It cited the example where the recent the loss of the 22 lives were suspected domestic terrorism opened fire on families in El Paso. It also discusses, based on prevalence of recently conducted attacks nationwide, that white racially motivated is currently the most violently active domestic terrorism type. This is from DPS. On university campuses, there have been instances where groups, individuals are posting flyers across a university. For example, at Texas State University, there was a large banner hanging from the library that read, "America is a white nation." It was a 10 feet wide by 3 feet tall, and it was by an organization that was a fascist white nationalist group.
Mr. Speaker?
Ms. Collier, for what
will the
purpose? Will the gentle lady yield for questions?
yield for questions?
Yes.
She yields for questions.
Okay, so, I appreciate you bringing this amendment because we want to make sure that our universities are being fair and even and not hiring individuals who participate or belong to domestic terroristic organizations. Now, what we learned from the January 6th attack of insurrection on our nation's capital is that those individuals do exist and they work. They work in everyday jobs. And so all you're asking, is my understanding, is that we do not allow or provide a space for our universities to have those types of individuals employed.
That's absolutely correct. And if
There's no space for those individuals here.
They shouldn't be hired in universities if they are a focus of, for example, DPS's domestic terrorism threat assessment. There are examples where there are articles that show how white supremacist groups are trying to recruit on college campuses, and there are articles that show Texas universities are not immune from these white supremacist groups. A lot of these white supremacist groups have been targeting, even nationwide. Colleges and universities saw a 7% increase of incidents where there were white supremacist campus recruiting across the country, and those incidents were in the 18-19 academic year. It said that uptick comes on top of a massive 77% of instances in white supremacist recruiting on campus during the previous academic year. This is an issue that we want to make sure if we're eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, if we're trying to say that we need to ensure that we are not bringing in on board and universities are not hiring people who have ties to these specific hate groups that are seen, that have these criminal connections. And so that's why I'm bringing this amendment.
We're not going to roll back. You don't want us to roll back any type of progress that we have made. And if by eliminating these offices that prohibit that type of behavior, you're concerned that we open ourselves up to more.
That's correct. The message that we are sending by eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion practices is a slap in the face to people of color, people who look like you and me, to students who look like you and me, to employees at universities who look like you and me. And so we want to ensure that these universities are not bringing in people who want to target us, who believe in that white supremacy, that they are better than us. And so that's why we're bringing this amendment.
There is a way, because you said DPS has a record. So there is a way for us to know who those individuals are before they are hired. So you're not creating any new practice. It's in existence. We want to make sure that it's used.
Correct.
I think you have a very valid amendment that we all should be very supportive of, because what you are doing is ensuring that all of our universities promote anti-discrimination policies that are not to the detriment of the people that they serve. So you're just saying, if we are going to have anti-discrimination policies, this should be one of them.
Correct.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am. Move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to oppose this. It does not further the purpose of the bill.
Ms. Collier, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman leave for a question? Yield for a question?
He's turned the microphone over to Ms. Niavi Criado to close on the amendment.
I close.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. Ms. Niavi Criado sends it up. It is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs on the adoption amendment. A record vote has been requested. The clerk ring the bell. Show Mr. Kemple voting nay, Ms. Niavi Criado voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 60 ayes and 80 nays, the amendment fails to adopt.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Doorkeeper.
Mr. Speaker, I have a messenger from the Senate at the door of the House.
Admit the messenger.
Mr. Speaker, I'm directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has taken the following action. The Senate has passed the following measures. SCR 55, Zaffarini, returning SB 1715 to the Senate for further consideration. Respectfully, Patsy Spa, Secretary of the Senate.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Zwiener.
Is Ms. Wiener on the floor of the House? The chair recognizes Ms. Wiener to explain the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this is a simple amendment that adds to the purposes for which an institution of higher education exists in Texas. Representative Kemple made some good changes in the committee substitute to the purposes of an institution of a higher education to include a place that can support an environment with academic freedom and intellectual inquiry, as well as a place where students have the opportunity to learn and succeed without regard to their identity or their political affiliation or social background. My amendment simply adds another category for the type of environment that Texas universities should be seeking to create. and it's an environment with racial, ethnic, and religious diversity that reflects the racial, ethnic, and religious diversity of the state of Texas. I know that we all celebrate diversity in this building. I know that the background and purpose of this bill actually really speaks to wanting to work towards the goal of diversity, and that instead we're just having a disagreement with how. So I believe that this amendment should be acceptable to the members of this body. If we really do want universities that reflect the people of the state of Texas, if we want universities that include our increasingly diversifying state, this should be an easy addition to the purposes. Texas, members, is now a minority-majority state. There are more people in the state of Texas who are not white, non-Latino, than who are. And we want that reflected in our institutions of higher education. As many of y'all know, I'm currently a student at the University of Texas Law School, and I don't see that diversity yet in my classroom, despite ongoing efforts made by the university. And so for us to make sure that we continue to achieve that goal of every single student having access to higher education, regardless of the color of their skin or their ethnic background, we should enshrine that goal in this legislation as well. And I'm happy to yield to questions if there are some.
Ms. Goodwin, for what
Will she
purpose
yield for
will the
questions?
gentlelady yield for questions?
I yield.
She yields for questions.
So, Representative Zwiener, it sounds like your amendment just says that our public universities should reflect the diversity of the state. Is that correct?
Yes, my amendment simply says that part of the purpose of the universities here in Texas is to create an environment that reflects the diversity that we all live around every single day.
So do you think that is what we have currently? Do you think that our universities reflect the diversity of our state currently?
I think our state universities, our public universities have made great strides, but quite frankly, I do not think we are there yet. I certainly, in my time on a campus right now, notice that my classmates and my professors are disproportionately white. Of course, there's a number of historical reasons that lead into that. And I hope that we can keep focused on the goal of making sure that door is open to everyone. Because you and I both know that the color of your skin, your ethnic background, your religious background, those have nothing to do with your actual inherent ability to succeed at an institution of higher education. And so if there's no difference in inherent ability, the question we're left with is what's getting in the way? And how do we help keep moving forward and getting rid of those barriers so that the face of our universities truly represents the face of Texas?
So the author of the bill said that the DEI programs that he's aware of were not effective. And so that's one of the reasons for the bill is that we're spending a lot of money on DEI departments that really aren't improving the diversity in our universities. Do you agree with that premise?
I don't agree with that, but I don't think it actually has much to do with this particular amendment. While the author and I disagree on the effectiveness of DEI programs, we, according to him, according to the bill, background and purpose, we agree that diversity, racial, ethnic, and religious diversity are important goals in our institutions of higher education. So my amendment does not prescribe any particular way of achieving that goal. It just puts into statute that that is one of the purposes of our institutions of higher education, to serve students regardless of their racial, ethnic, and religious diversity, and to try and foster an environment that reflects that diversity.
Well, I agree with the goal. I think that we all agree that our universities ought to reflect the makeup of the state. And so I will support your amendment.
Thank you, Representative Goodwin.
Ms. Collier, for
Mr. Speaker, will the gentlelady yield for questions?
I do yield.
She yields for questions.
Okay, so I appreciate you bringing this amendment because all you're asking is that we have student populations or faculty that reflect the racial diverse makeup of Texas, right?
Absolutely. I want to make sure that our faculty, our staff, our students move towards that goal of reflecting the face of Texas.
So are you familiar with the student population of African Americans at the University of Texas?
I am not advised of that number. Are you
My
Representative
understanding is
Collier?
that the population has been stagnant. They have not increased the student population, and I'm very concerned that if we eliminate policies and procedures that promote diversity, it's going to be even worse. So we're not going to be able to we're not going to have progress if we eliminate these programs and policies that are geared towards increasing diversity at these universities. So I definitely want to make sure that we have a provision in place, because my understanding is that the African American population in Texas is over 12%, and at the University of Texas, it's about 5 or 6%. So
that's very concerning that it's about half, especially since we know our proportions of our population for people of color are actually higher among younger college-age groups. So I'm concerned, especially if that number is remaining stagnant, when we know that almost all of the growth in Texas between the 2010 and the 2020 census was due to growth among the African American population and the Hispanic population. That growth should be reflected in our halls of higher education. And I think that if we want to see that growth continue, if we want to see it be reflected, if we want to see the gains of the past few decades continue, or break stagnation patterns that you've brought up, we need to make it clear that a core goal, a core purpose of our institutions of higher education is to reflect the face of the people of Texas.
in fact, that would promote equity.
Excuse me?
It would promote equity if we did that.
It would build equity, and it would make sure that young people across Texas, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or religious background, have the same access to education, one of the best educations in the world, and that same stepping stone to go on and succeed in the workforce and the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate your amendment, and I'll be voting for it.
Members, everyone today has said that we all agree that our universities should be diverse places where all Texans are welcome and celebrated. Members, if that's the case, this amendment should be an easy yes vote, because all my amendment does is says that it is part of the purpose of our institutions of higher education to build an environment that reflects the racial, ethnic, and religious diversity that is here in Texas. I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kimball in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this amendment is just contrary to what we're trying to do here. We're eliminating DEI offices at the same time promoting recruitment for everybody. So I will respectfully oppose.
The chair recognizes Ms. Weiner to close on the amendment.
Members, I'm going to be frank. I'm a little confused about why Representative Kimball is opposing this amendment. My amendment does not reverse any of the substantive provisions in the bill regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. All my amendment does is says one of the purposes of our institutions of higher education is to represent the people of Texas. If we do not want to go back to a day where our institutions are segregated, if we do not want to go back to a day where the number of people of color in our universities was breathtakingly low, then we should vote yes on this amendment. We should add this to this bill. The only reason not to take this amendment is if the intent of this bill is in fact discriminatory. And that is what multiple folks have stood up here today and said that no, the intent of this bill is not discriminatory. So if the intent of this bill is to try and preserve diverse student bodies and faculty bodies at our universities, vote yes. If you don't support diverse student bodies, vote no. It's as simple as that. I move adoption.
Ms. Weiner sends an amendment. The amendment is not acceptably altered. The question occurs in adoption. Amendment. The record vote. The clerk read the bell. Ms. Weiner voting aye. Mr. Kemp voting nay. Mr. Toth. Mr. Ashby voting no. Have all members voted? There being 60 ayes and 83 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Garcia.
The chair recognizes Ms. Garcia to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. Excuse me, sorry. This amendment would strike on line 4, page 4, line 2, the word may and substitute it with shall, because this is a very simple amendment. And what happens here is it changes something that could be very consequential. It strikes may and substitutes it with shall to make the approval of DEI offices that are required by grants and accreditors mandatory rather than permissive. If these grants and accreditors require a college or university to have a DEI office in order to be approved, why would the text of this bill imply that a board could just refuse the establishment? This is a very easy part of the bill to fix, and it ensures that those DEI offices that are required by grants, accreditors, etc., do not have any roadblocks to them. Members, I urge you to vote yes on this amendment.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just changing a may to a shall, where our intent is to better leave the decision to the governing board. So I'll respectfully oppose.
The chair recognizes Ms. Garcia to close on the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm new here. I just got here. I've never served in politics before. As I've been listening to the arguments and the debates around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I had to take myself back to basics because I almost felt like it was something that I didn't understand. Listening to the just very polarizing conversations around here based on something that I don't understand to be bad. Diversity, it says diversity is the state of being diverse in variety. Do we not want that? Equity. Equity is being fair and impartial. Is that not our jobs as legislators? Inclusion, the action or state of including or being included with a group or structure. Are we not inclusive? I'm so confused what the fight is over diversity, equity, and inclusion. And forgive me, I'm trying really hard not to get emotional, but this is something that has become very emotional because this is an attack on me as an essential person. And I'm going to tell you how in so many ways. When I look at everything in the bill and who this impacts, it impacts a veteran. It impacts somebody who's economically disadvantaged. It impacts somebody who is of color. It impacts somebody with a disability. I have all of those things, and I'm not the only one in here. My baby boys, they're 20 years old, they have autism. These DEI offices are there to help people like them, to help adults like them just try to live life normal. We're seeking to be normal. Mr. Speaker, I move passage.
Ms. Collier,
Will the gentlelady yield for a question?
will the gentlelady yield for questions?
Yes, I will
She
yield
yields
for
for
questions.
Thank you for your comments and your passionate advocacy for this provision. But you just mentioned something about your twins. You said that they're not only disabled, they're also a person of color.
Yes, ma'am.
And so by eliminating the DEI policies and procedures, you're eliminating one opportunity that they would have, one avenue to have equity by eliminating those offices. So right now they would have a provision under the ADA, which is what Chair Kemple said is still valid, but by removing the DEI office and policies and procedures, you're eliminating alternative avenues for them. So they do not have the same opportunities that they would have if this, bill did not pass. Is that right?
Absolutely, ma'am, and I'll tell you, my boys worked very hard to become high school graduates. They graduated from high school through general ed. It was not easy for them. It was very difficult. We just got to the point to where they want to go to college. They want to be like the other kids. And we're working on that. My oldest son got accepted to A&M San Antonio, and we were hoping to send the twins there as well because they have a wonderful diversity, equity, and inclusion program that not only would help them as students with special needs, but also help them navigate the system of being a university student. And this hits me particularly hard because I needed those services as a veteran with PTSD when I left the military and went back to college. It's terrifying for me as a mother to special needs children, and I have to be honest with you and let you know that now my decision has to be seriously considered for the safety of my sons, because without having those people in place at the DEI office, the things that they offer help them navigate being a college student. And without that, I'm not sure how they'd be able to navigate.
Because one other thing you said, you identified what makes us a rich state is because of the diversity. But if we eliminate these offices with the policies and procedures, we will not be able to have people in place that can identify and actually understand the challenges and differences that are associated with our cultural and historical background, because they will not be able to recognize when somebody may be angry but they're really hungry, or when somebody may be angry but maybe they lost their job. And so people respond to different situations differently. They respond to situations differently. But the whole point of this diversity, equity, inclusion was to help those identify the differences on cultural and racial and gender differences, so that way they're not being penalized for being themselves.
Absolutely. And you said angry. You mentioned that word angry. I want to tell you, my twins are very expressive, and a lot of times their expressions are confused for anger. They're not angry, they just don't know how to express themselves.
Or maybe we speak a little louder.
Absolutely.
As a person of color, because we're not heard. I'm going to say that again. Maybe it could be that sometimes people of color speak louder because they're not heard. It doesn't mean that they are being offensive. It's just they want to be heard, and that's the opportunity that these DEI offices provide. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Speaker, I move passage.
Ms. Garcia said that the amendment was not acceptable. A record vote has been requested. The clerk ring the bell. So Ms. Garcia voting aye, Mr. Kemp voting nay. Ms. Jones of Harris voting aye. Mr. Diallo voting aye. Nay. Nay. Have all members voted? There being 60 ayes and 82 nays, the amendment fails to adopt.
Speaker?
Ms. Collier, for what purpose?
I move to have all the dialogue on the front mic and the back mic reduced to writing and placed into the journal.
Ms. Collier, I believe that request has already been made and
Perfect.
granted. Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by manual.
The chair recognizes Mr. Manuel to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This amendment clarifies the discussion of the various forms of discrimination and systematic inequalities are permitted. I know that some people say that it's already in the bill. This is just trying to clarify to make sure that it's evident and clear. We're just making sure that this is evident and clear. The reason that I'm asking this, I think, is that since we're making a drastic change to our education system that has not been changed in this way, I think this is just a safe way to make sure that everyone knows what we're doing, why we're doing it, but also to make sure, more importantly, that people can still have the same discussions on campus.
Mr. Busey, for what purpose?
Yield for some questions.
The gentleman yield for questions.
I do.
The gentleman yields.
Representative, just to clarify, what you're doing with this amendment is guaranteeing that it's still free speech based, that curriculum is not being hit, that we can teach history, teach facts, teach what's going on. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And you've been told by the bill author that this is protected,
but you want to make sure that it's spelled out in the.
Yes, the author says that he believes that it's in the bill. I just am asking if we can just clarify and make sure that our
bill author
universities
thinks it's
know.
already in there.
Right.
We're doubling down, making sure that this happens.
Right, exactly.
Well, it's a good amendment. Let's make sure it gets on. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respectfully oppose this amendment. This bill does nothing to instruction or curriculum. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Manuel to close on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker and members, I'm just going to say it just like this. I think it's very important. Those who do not know the history are doomed to repeat it. Women's suffrage, how we have moved so far to make sure that we have protected adults with intellectual disabilities, the very criminal justice reform work that we've done here in this body. All I'm asking is making sure that on university campus that students, professors, everyone on campus knows exactly what they are still able to talk about. When we're making big changes like this, when we've made them to different pieces of legislation, we have always complained that when we're making changes this drastically at a whim, when we know people do not always pay attention to what's happening here in this body, if we're not doing that, we could be leaving a gap where people are not going to know what they can talk about. And all this is just clarifying is saying, please allow us to be able to let people know they still have their right to free speech. History is not being blocked. Let's remember this, more importantly, that I always tell people that some people don't know. One of the worst massacres of lynchings in this country happened in California, and it was to Chinese immigrants. And it was all because of false information. Because someone thought that they had murdered a sheriff's officer and a worker in the late 1800s. How many of us are going to be able to make sure that something like that doesn't happen if we're not ensured that we can talk about certain things? I don't want to take much of your time. I know that everyone's tired and people are confused and they're already set in stone. But please, please, I am desperately asking you, history is the most important thing that if we lose it, if people fear to talk about it, then we lose everything that we hold of value. I move passage.
Mr. Manuel sent an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs in the adoption amendment. This is the record vote. The clerk will read the bill. So Mr. Manuel voting aye, Mr. Kemple voting nay, Mr. Ashby voting nay, Mr. Dayala voting nay, Ms. Swanson voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 58 ayes and 83 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Jones of Harris.
The chair recognizes Ms. Jones of Harris to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Universities require that student organizations update their registration every year in order to be recognized. However, because of the transition of student organizations and the fee requirements attached to those registrations, their registration is not always up to date. These student organizations may still have their money tied up with the university, so this would harm student organizations unnecessarily simply because their registration is not up to date. Recognized by, in quotes, is ambiguous because universities communicate that registration is how the universities recognize student organizations. The amendment for Senate Bill 17 reads as follows. On page 4, lines 18 through 19, strike registered with or recognized by an institution of higher education. And I believe this amendment prevents unnecessary harm to student organizations that may be tied to their registrations. As a person who was a member of very many student organizations when I was at the University of Houston, I'm a member of a sorority, continue to be. I was a member of the Black Student Union. I was a member of MASO, the Mexican American Students Organization. And I know that going to a PWI was difficult to find people who looked like me, who made me feel comfortable. Most of my professors did not look like me. In fact, the only professors that I had who looked like me were in the African American Studies department. And so I felt lonely. when I joined MASO, the Mexican American Students Organization. It helped me to understand the unique challenges with the Hispanic culture. And I also learned that Hispanic people aren't all from Mexico, which I actually thought before I went to the University of Houston. So that helped me understand unique issues. That was important. I had the opportunity to march with Cesar Chavez as a member of MASO, which I had no idea as a black person from 3rd Ward, Houston, Texas, the issues with people who picked fruit and who had pesticides that were harmful that caused them to have higher incidences of health defects because of that. It was my ability to join these organizations to teach me the special interests of these organizations. And again, I'll go back to MASO. I did not have any idea that a lot of the kids who were Hispanic, their parents didn't speak English, which meant that their parents couldn't even help them study in school. Which, think about it, you speak English, your kids go to schools where you speak English, and you can't help your kids because you don't speak English. I think that it enlarges what we understand as college students, because we are in college so that we can learn, so that we can be more productive citizens, so that we can be tolerant and appreciate other people. And so I absolutely believe that this is a common sense amendment that makes sure that we don't discriminate against students and that we are supportive of the student organizations that they join or that we join to help us feel like we are a meaningful and integral part of our university environment, and that we learn about people other than ourselves, because the world needs to be bigger than just us. And so we need to protect that. And my mom went to an HBCU, my dad went to an HBCU, and I can tell you the kinds of support that my mother explained to me she had at an HBCU, I had to go and find student organizations to try to find that support. And I'm asking you to vote in favor. I'm asking you to vote in favor of this amendment, because it is important that students in educational environments that are not surrounded by people who look like them with similar backgrounds be able to join organizations to help them to fit in and to learn about people who are different than themselves.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to respectfully oppose this amendment. The bill does nothing to restrict student services nor student organizations.
The chair recognizes Ms. Jones of Harris to close on the amendment.
And I will urge you again that this body, it shouldn't matter. It should not be a D and an R debate. This should be about what's the most important for our students. I mean, the truth is, we learn white history all day, every day at schools. Why cannot we learn about people other than what I guess is, I don't even want to know that it's called normal, but I think that what we should do in this body is to support our students and to make sure that they are well-rounded students. And I'm hopeful that moving forward, that the students don't make decisions like we are making in this body, where we look at some political party and we vote a political party, because colleges and universities should be about more than that. And organizations that help us learn about the broader world are very important. And I urge you to vote yes on this amendment. Thank you.
Ms. Jones of Harris, send that amendment. The amendment is not acceptable. The author, this is the record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Ms. Jones of Harris voting aye. Mr. Kemple voting nay. Asprey voting nay. Mr. Deyala voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 60 ayes and 83 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Niave Criado.
The chair recognizes Ms. Niave Criado to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is in the section regarding the types of programs that are going to be exempted. And what I'm proposing is that if there are programs at universities that are promoting and trying to support and uplift women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, that we want to protect those programs and make sure that they are not subject to the provisions of this bill. We want to close the STEM gender gap by providing young girls and women with an environment that nurtures and expands their passion for these fields. We need more women to enter STEM fields. So these programs must include women from different communities, and we want to foster education and the STEM workforce. Universities all over Texas have created programs to attract these women into these fields. And so that's why we want to protect these programs. Increasing gender diversity in these STEM fields leads to improved research outcomes, as the perspectives of women in these fields can provide unique insights into research questions. And so I request that you support these programs for women in STEM. I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respectfully oppose this amendment because it creates curriculum requirements outside of the bill.
The chair recognizes Ms. Nialve Criado to close on the amendment.
Support women in STEM. Move adoption.
Ms. Nialve Criado sent the amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. So Ms. Nialve Criado voting aye, Mr. Kemple voting nay, Mr. Ashby voting nay, Mr. Deyala voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 59 ayes and 82 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Flores.
The chair recognizes Ms. Flores to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is a simple amendment. The bill currently includes exceptions that are numbered 1 through 7. This would add an additional number to those exceptions. This one would amend the Committee Substitute Senate Bill 17 on page 4 between lines 24 and 25 by inserting the following appropriately numbered subdivision and renumbering subsequent subdivisions accordingly. It would include instruction, programming, or training for which attendance is voluntary and that is intended to explain topics from the perspective of a group that is historically underrepresented in higher education. So let me explain why. This amendment would clarify that voluntarily attended programming and education would be more reflective of marginalized groups. In other words, teaching history in a way that reflects the stories of ethnically diverse folks, disabled folks, veterans, and other underrepresented people in the United States. When I came to the university, it was an opportunity to learn from others. This is a great opportunity that gives us the ability to learn from other Texans and about the histories that make up our big, wonderful state. So this would include volunteer-attended style instruction and programming that would include the stories and histories and experiences of a wide variety of groups that should be promoted, especially at our institutions of higher education, so that students have the ability to learn about the numerous people that exist in the Texas population. You know, this addition would give schools the freedom to host programming and instruction sessions on relevant topics, so individuals attending or working for a university have the option to learn more about populations unlike their own, so thereby enhancing diversity. A simple amendment. I ask that you please consider supporting this amendment and passage.
The chair recognizes Mr. Kemple in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respectfully oppose the amendment because it creates curriculum requirements and training programs outside of the scope of the bill.
The chair recognizes Ms. Flores to close on the amendment.
Again, members, this would just expand the list of exceptions, and this would allow for voluntarily attended programming and topics that would allow folks the opportunity to participate in programming and instruction sessions, and it would just give them the opportunity to learn more about our differences and what we have in common. So please vote for this amendment. Thank you.
Ms. Flores, send up the amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. The question occurs in the adoption of the amendment. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Ms. Flores voting aye, Mr. Kemple voting nay, Mr. Ashby voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 60 ayes and 83 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.